My guest today is Dr. Pierre Kory, pulmonary and critical care specialist, president and CMO of the FLCCC, and best-selling author. We discussed the sudden surge in all-cause excess mortality, his defense of Canadian Dr. Charles Hoffe, and takedown of the British Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons, and the evidence behind mRNA vaccine shedding. Dr. Kory is an expert in his field and one of the loudest voices pushing back against the weaponization of healthcare. He's a hero with a message everyone should hear. Stay tuned. Dr. Pierre Kory, having some wardrobe malfunctions. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing all right. Thanks, my friend. Good to see you.
It's great to see you again, man. You were one of the first people I talked to for this podcast. The response was amazing. Everybody was, first of all, couldn't believe that Dr. Pierre Kory talked to me in the first place, but everybody was also really, really happy with a lot of the things that you had to say, because you're one of the rare truth tellers in the world right now, and you've been a really loud voice for truth. And it's just amazing that you're part of this small handful of people that are out there and sharing real actual data and information. And you're now the ivermectin doctor, but you're so much more than that, right?
Well, it's cool what you're saying, because literally I used to, this before, I guess I'm a little bit of a public figure now, but before that, like when I was in academic medicine, I would have people coming up to me and they'd be like, "Oh, Dr. Kory, I really appreciate what you said in that meeting." Like, I don't know, my whole, like, I don't have to think about it, but like when I hear bullshit, nothing making sense, I'm like, I'd be at a meeting, even with like leaders, and I'd be like, "Excuse me, why are we doing this?" Like, how does this make sense? Like, I would ask the question, like the elephant in the room, and then especially at the University of Wisconsin, which is the Midwest. And you just hear people like quiet, like some people looking down. Others would be like, "Ooh, this is," for Wisconsin to be a little drama, because, a New Yorker comes in like, "Why are we doing it this way, guys? Like, you've been doing this for 10 years. We do it this way back east. And why don't we change this?" You get it. But I always called it like I saw it.
Yeah, bringing the action to Kenosha, right?
Yeah, it was Madison, but same thing.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk to you about an op-ed that you co-authored for The Hill, where you wrote about the all-cause excess mortality and the sudden surge in numbers.
Yep.
Can you talk about the all-cause mortality numbers, the data that you've seen, the demographics affected, and what you think the causes are?
Yeah. Well, that last one's the easy one, but yeah, I got to credit, first of all, I'm going to credit partners, right? So we all have to give a big shout out to Ed Dowd, right? I'm sure. Have you had Ed on?
No, I haven't. I've reached out, but I'm still waiting for a response.
Yeah. No, I mean, Ed is the one, former BlackRock managing director, and he knew something was going south. He started to see deaths and injuries around him. And the data is just so crazy. I mean, he started seeing, he was starting to look at actuarial databases, and then disability databases, and you could see this tight temporal relationship, right? So like onset of the vaccines, and suddenly you saw these just massive rises in really bad things happening to people. Not only theirs, right? I mean, it's funny because I've debated things in my career where there is gray area, where the evidence to do it this, like we always argue on how to do something better, like in medicine, different procedures, processes, treatments. And there was a lot of gray. But on this one, I've never seen something where the data is just so overwhelmingly clear. But it's the data, meaning the totality of the data. If you just look at what's in the peer-reviewed literature, you get a very different story. But this is like, and I think I said this before we came on, I was like, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. I mean, the questions that I'm being asked to answer are so overwhelmingly clear. The answers are just overwhelmingly supported by the data. But, when Ed Dowd started doing that work, it was interesting. This is how I kind of got involved in studying this aspect of the pandemic. This is maybe a year and a half ago. Ed Dowd and a guy named Josh Sterling reached out to me. Josh Sterling is like a longtime life insurance industry consultant. And they reached out to me, Ryan Cole, Robert Malone, Peter McCullough, might have been someone else in that group, but they basically said to us, listen, we're seeing a signal in the life insurance industry that is just really, really bad. And we have put together a meeting with like all the top life insurance companies in the country and their CEOs and or representatives. And we want you guys to give a presentation on what's really happening because they're seeing signals here that are really disturbing. And I sat in on that meeting and it was really weird. So I gave my piece. In fact, that at that meeting, I wasn't talking about mortality data. I was really talking about what was going on with ivermectin because they were interested in that, right? Because it's the suppression of early treatments, which could have prevented a whole lot of death claims, right? Had we treated early and aggressively. But like, I gotta tell you, there was probably 20 squares on that Zoom call. I think there were two people with their cameras on. And Josh told me later, he moderated the session. He told me later that of all the CEOs that are invited, mostly they sent their underlings, to sit there. And at the end of our presentations, like only two people asked questions. One was a state regulator from a large state in this country who regulates the life insurance industry. And then another one was like a chief actuary of a major life insurance company. And she and the regulator were really engaged, asking questions. Clearly, were very, very concerned. Clearly, well, one or the other was not confused at what we were talking about. But like when it came time for questions, 20 squares on, no cameras on, just like no questions. And although I continued to work with Josh for a little bit after that, you could tell that the road ahead was going to be long. And I couldn't figure it out because I said to Josh, I said, how can you have people running these major corporations whose bottom line depend on young people not dying at unprecedented rates? Why aren't they doing anything? And I'm not going to be able to be totally true to his answer because I don't understand business and corporations or that business, but he said that he says it's a very strange thing. The way those corporations are run, the way their accounting is, he said the signal that you're seeing in the mortality will not show up blaring red on their balance sheets for like another couple of years. And even when it does, they'll do other weird things. And then he just gave me an example. He said one example is the entire long-term care industry. Like, how they started selling long-term care policies? Without going into it, Josh told me like from the beginning, from the first sale of the first policy, it was a losing product. Like it was a total money losing product. And he said that industry is still alive 25 years later and still hemorrhages money. So
Wow.
like,
Yeah.
like there wasn't, I couldn't understand it. Like if I just figured like if I was a CEO of one of those companies and I started seeing, these massive, losses, all these young people, and those were the people in the group life health insurance industry, which generally means corporations like Fortune 500. See, those are the most successful, most educated, most wealthiest members of our society, and they're dying in droves. And and you had a claim on a 25-year-old, a 30-year-old. Hello, I mean, you're paying out a lifetime of a policy that they've only paid in for a few years. So I would have thought that the CEOs would be behaving much more boldly, but you know what? They're no different than everything else we've seen. Everyone's keeping their head down. No one wants to stick their head up and say what really needs to be said. And so, anyway, that's where my interest started. And then I started, studying the vaccines, all aspects of them, and I started watching excess mortality. And so I want to give credit to Ed, and then also my co-writer, which is Mary Beth Pfeiffer, who's done such great work throughout COVID. I mean, just a phenomenal investigative journalist, and she and I are friends, and I want to give credit to her because she really does the drafts. I like tinker, poke, I push back. The challenge with those op-eds, you got to understand this, is we never know how hard we can push. Like if you see, so I did really, you're asking about the Hill. So I published one, we published one in August in USA Today. We called out the excess mortality in the most dramatic way. The word vaccine did not appear in the, we were like, we need to look into this, folks. It could, and then we said it could be this, could be that. I can't remember exactly what we put out there as hypotheses, but it wasn't the vaccines. That was August. Then we published in Newsweek, maybe November. I think that was November, Newsweek. And there towards the end on the list of things, we kind of mentioned the vaccines a little bit. But the Hill, we were kind of, that was the boldest we ever got. And the Hill, we were also working with another actuarial expert. Um, and we were finding like new data. I think the most alarming thing in the Hill was that in the first 9 months of 2023, 158,000 Americans died, more than predicted, right? Death rates outside of wartime, outside of, plagues and things like that, are generally stable in our society. Or if they move, like for instance, one of the life insurance industry CEOs, the famous quote that he used is he said, a 10% rise in mortality in our business is a 1 in 200 year event. In 2021, third quarter 2021, they saw a 40% rise.
Holy.
And anyway, so we talked about 158,000 Americans in the first 9 months, which is more than all the combat losses from Vietnam and beyond. And so I think that got a lot of attention. It created a little bit of a news cycle. And I'm just trying to bring attention to America. I'm just trying to save lives. I think if people read that, um, I think already a lot of people are questioning the vaccines, right? We know the uptake is slow for the last boost. I think the whole little campaign is kind of dying. Pfizer's, looking at losses and, they had their run, but I will tell you, there's still a not insignificant number who will, there's still people propagandized enough, lied to enough, where I still think they feel like they should show up for their next booster, and that could be the last thing that they do.
Oh my God. Yeah. So what age groups are most like, I mean, what does the data reflect in terms of age group?
Yeah, so that was another really powerful point that we discovered in our analysis in the Hill op-ed. We discovered that we were talking about 2023 deaths. We discovered that over 65, their excess mortality was a -6%, meaning it wasn't the old people dying. So it was clearly young. And the most dramatic were, I think, 15, 15 to 20, 15 to 24, 25 to 34. Those were insane. Yeah, basically all young people. And that also is supported by the fact that, and what triggered the op-ed actually, so here's how we do the op-eds is I do get PR advice, and we do work with a firm that helps the FLCCC, my nonprofit. And they'll tell me like, hey, Pierre, you might want to address this. There's a little bit of a news cycle on this, and you might want to try to correct the record. And what prompted that op-ed is the FDA, Robert Califf, when he literally tweeted about the drop in life expectancy in the US.
Yeah.
And then in 3 years, it went from 79 to 76. That, yes, it did drop a little bit in 2020, but in order to drop from 79 to 76, it's not 80-year-olds who are dying, right? It's not
Yeah.
85, it's the 20-year-olds, the 25-year-olds. I mean, you can't have a drop like that with 300 million people unless it's a whole bunch of young people dying. And so I think that's why there might have been a little appetite for that op-ed, but yeah, it was clearly the young people. And then, in a former op-ed, we pointed out that when you looked at all the young people dying, you could actually see that white collar was dying at a higher rate. That they were all up: white, blue, and it's white, gray, and blue. There's three colors. Gray is like cops and teachers. Um, um, White collar had the highest excess mortality. Gray collar was in between, and then blue collar the lowest. And so, I always, whenever I talk about this, I always say to people like, can anyone tell me what happened in the workplace, the corporate workplace in 2021 that would cause the most employed and wealthiest laborers in society to die more than anyone else? And I mean, the elephant in the room is the vaccines. So that third quarter of 2021, you can look at the U.S. Society of Actuaries May 2023 report, and they actually have like each quarter, and they show you the excess mortality, and they even use color gradings. I think it was like yellow, green, and red. And you see these flashing reds with 100% increases in excess, not 10%, not 40, 100% increases in excess mortality in the third quarter of 2021 in young age groups. And it's, you almost look at it and you almost have to gasp because it looks like there was a terrorist event or a war that broke out.
That is, it's jaw dropping, right? Now, in the data, I mean, look, I'm splitting hairs here because I think we know what the cause is. But are you able to delineate between, say, for example, what's COVID, which we know most of it wouldn't be because these people are so young, what's, say, for example, drug overdoses, what is suicide? Like, are you able to delineate between the causes?
So you can, that's a different analysis, and we've done that. All of those are causes of death, but the major are actually not, it's not deaths of despair, it's not suicides, it's not drug. I mean, those all may have risen, and obviously COVID explains some of the deaths, um, but it doesn't explain the third quarter of 2021. I mean, there's no evidence to support a sudden rash of suicides, a sudden massive doubling of drug overdoses. Most of it, it's really cardiovascular deaths, kidney disease, liver disease, and a little bit of cancer. Although the cancer stuff is what we're working on now. Cancer data is a little delayed, but there's even when like so this whole thing started, this whole life insurance data thing, and let's talk about real quickly why it's so important that it's life insurance data because this is another like teaching point I want to give like to your listeners is that the reason why me as a physician is suddenly like Mr. Life Insurance industry expert, isn't that a little weird? What the hell do I know about actuarial data? Well, the problem, and this is a really dark thing, is because so much, if not all, of the scientific literature is completely corrupted. You cannot rely on like epidemiology papers. They've all been censored. You can't publish a paper. You can't publish a paper showing that the vaccines are causing death. None of the medical journals will ever, publish that. None of the health agency leaders will start talking about that as like a public health service warning. Um, but actuarial data you can't mess with. I mean, that's the lifeblood of that industry. That whole industry is run on really tight monitoring and predictions, and that's what they do for a living. And so it's the most, how should I say, unblemished data. The one thing that the life insurance data doesn't have, they might have cause of death, and this is what thing that they bemoan because I did other meetings with that group, but they don't have vaccination status.
Mm.
Life insurance claims that's not something that they can get in their databases. So, I mean, that's like probably the real smoking gun, but I'm sorry, when you see rises like that in third quarter of 2021 suddenly, and it's young people who we know don't die from COVID at such ridiculous rates, there's really nothing else you can blame it on. But anyway.
Yeah, of course. Now, I mean, I guess that leads to my next question because I've read a lot about turbo cancers, which
Mm.
to a layman like me, turbo cancer sounds like flat Earth. It's like turbo cancer. What the fuck is that? But it's a real thing and it's really happening. And I read a piece from Dr. William Mackis, who was talking about young people showing up at the emergency room with stage 4 cancer, like no symptoms at all, and then showing up and they're 6 months away from dying. uh has there been a link, uh has there been a connection made between turbo cancers and the COVID vaccines?
Um, so that I'm gonna have to say, outside of ethical skeptic, I don't know if you follow him on Twitter.
Hmm.
In my network, I know people who know him, and apparently they have the highest respect for his acumen. He's apparently extremely uh, sophisticated and advanced kind of epidemiologist, statistician. Um, and he does all of these really sophisticated analyses, and he shows an explosion in cancer. And Ed Dowd just got real data now from UK. So I don't have good stuff from the US, but I did take a not a deep look at Ed Dowd's report because to be honest, at this point, I know it's causing all of this stuff. Like you know, if I'm going to do an op-ed on cancer, yes, then I'll look at Ed Dowd's data and I'll try to use that for something. But But yeah, the data is there. It's really alarming. But I say even before the data. So like if you look at like the origin story of like Steve Kirsch's involvement in looking at vaccines, Ed Dowd's, what prompted it? What prompted it wasn't that they read a paper or saw a study, is that literally in their reality, Steve knew someone who had three family members die within a week of the vaccine. And he just knew right then and there, I mean, that it was statistically impossible for someone he knew to have three family members die within a week of the vaccine. And he knew that they weren't safe effective. And then, like, I think his gardener was injured, had a heart attack the next day after the vaccine. And so he started looking into this. For me, with the cancers, is I have never, up until I would say the last 6 months, 8 months, maybe a little bit longer. My network's really big now. I know too many people now, but like people are reaching out, and I'm just hearing stories after stories. And you read my Substack, and I'm sure you've read my nursing reports from the front lines of the vaccine catastrophe. It's kind of a series I have. Well, this nurse that I've become friendly and close with, I mean, she is sharp as a tack, been around forever, knows everyone. And some of the stuff I put in my Substacks, but like she's friends with like senior oncologists, and she I remember she sent me a screenshot once of the AM schedule of one of the neuro oncologists, and there was like six glioblastomas, new patients, one morning, which is unheard of. And the ages were bizarre, like in the 20s. And I got to tell you, I'll take a little bit of attack, but are you aware of what Paul Marik, my partner in the FLCCC, what he's done with cancer in the last 6 months?
I'm not. Please
Yeah.
go into that.
So Paul got really interested in looking at cancer. And I don't want to get too geeky and sciencey here, but I'll just present it briefly. There's been some even Nobel Prize winner, the guy named Warburg back in the 30s, as well as some several other small group of really high level oncologists who have been saying over the last 70 years that our scientific paradigm for what causes cancer is actually wrong. The pathophysiology of cancer that the entire system follows, which is what's called a single somatic mutation algorithm or paradigm, somatic mutation, which means that these mutations form in your DNA and then it causes your cells to rapidly divide in an uncontrolled manner. But there's been an alternative hypothesis that's been bandied about that you never hear about, which is this metabolic cause. And Paul read this book. And the reason why I can talk so eloquently about it is because I just read the book like over the last week. And I was shocked. I was absolutely shocked at how much research is showing that actually what causes the rise in those mutations is actually a metabolic problem that has to do with the mitochondria. I'll stop there and I won't go too further, but Paul started reading about cancer and he started to find out all of these things. It's almost like anything you do with medicine. As soon as you start studying a topic, you find out all the things they don't tell you. Because medical education and how we practice is such a curated slice of what's out there. And so he wrote a scientific monograph based on like 1,300 papers, 4 books that he read. And it's sort of he called it Cancer Care. It's on our website at FLCCC.net. But it's essentially like the top 20 repurposed therapies for cancer based on clinical trials, evidence, mechanisms, safety, as well as even case series and reports. And I mean, we are aware of so many cases of just tremendous impacts from repurposed drugs. And actually, one of the things that we're doing because of this rise, I was telling you, I'm getting so many calls, and Paul's done this work. There are a lot of people falling ill with cancer now, and they want as best care and best prognosis that they can instead of just going into the system, chemo, radiation, surgery. If you're lucky, you get surgery. And so we've now put together some combination repurposed drug protocols, which just today, Mary Beth Pfeiffer published. If you look on her Twitter today, she just reported 2 cases of full remissions with just ivermectin. And in my private practice, which actually specializes in long COVID and long vaccine injury, I'm actually going to start doing complementary cancer care using really a metabolic model, which is complementary but separate from what the system does. And in fact, I'm seeing a patient today, 21-year-old with advanced brain cancer.
Oh,
Not doing well, apparently. I don't
oh.
know how much I can help her because I have to see the case, but apparently she's quite advanced. And but there are a lot of people want help. And so as someone who's done a lot of reading lately of about the metabolic causes and about the roles that these very safe repurposed drugs, you've probably heard it like mebendazole, ivermectin, metformin, atorvastatin's good, the oxycycline is good, melatonin, vitamin D is really important. You do high dose vitamin D therapies. IV vitamin C. I mean, lots of doctors, integrative oncologists have had really good success with a number of these therapies. And so, anyway, that's kind of, although it's tragic, the cancer data is really alarming, and I think it's going to get a lot worse. We're trying to, almost like we did with COVID, we're trying to help out, these catastrophes that they keep unleashing.
Yeah, and so I want to ask you, in your own practice, like, I've heard Jimmy Dore mention that you've been helping him with his vaccine injury, and in your own practice, like, how many of your patients are just purely vaccine injured? Like, are you seeing a large number of people with these problems?
Yeah. So my practice, me and my partner, what we see is we see long COVID. And what I think everyone should start calling is long vax. Apparently, no one calls it long vax because everything just gets, shoved under long COVID. But to answer your question specifically, our patients with that syndrome, we have over 1,000, 70% are triggered by the vaccine. So long vax is way more common than long COVID. The only differences between the two syndromes is on average, the vaccinated are sicker than long COVID with some pretty couple of pretty astounding exceptions, but on average, the vaccine injured syndromes are much sicker than long COVID. And then the other thing is, what long COVID is, although it's a new name for a disease, it's not a new disease. It's actually meets the criteria for myalgic encephalitis chronic fatigue syndrome, MECFS as it's called. And that's been around for decades and associated with viruses, but it's debilitating. And the disease essentially rests on three pillars: new severe debilitating fatigue, severe post-exertional malaise, and some amount of brain fog or cognitive deficits. And that's what CFS has been for a long time. And then there's a whole side menu of stuff, lots of POTS and dysautonomia and sensory neuropathies, motor neuropathies. And so it's a wickedly complex disease. And we are I'm in a network of colleagues who have changed their practices to focus on this disease, and all we're doing is sharing notes, sharing experiences, because we're not getting any help from the government. There's very little research, although that's changing a little bit of late. There's been a couple of decent trials that have helped me add a couple of therapies to my regimen. So, but certainly there's not as much research as should be being done because so many people out there are sick.
Yeah, and actually, I kind of want to pivot back to what you were talking about with the corrupted journals, because you wrote a four-part series on what Dr. Charles Hoffe is going through with the College of Physicians in British Columbia, and this one is one that's close to my heart because I'm originally from Vancouver. I'm in Alberta now, but I was in Vancouver during COVID, and Dr. Charles Hoffe's name came up really early on because I think there were a lot of people that realized we had been had very early in the game,
Yep.
especially once yourself and Dr. Malone appeared on Dark Horse. I feel like that's when the door really opened. And so I started looking into Dr. Hoff and his story, what he's gone through. So for people listening, Dr. Charles Hoff is a practitioner in Lytton, which is a very small town in British Columbia, north of the Lower Mainland, nowhere anywhere near Vancouver. And he was starting to see people who were taking the vaccine and then coming back within a couple of weeks and having these insane injuries like strokes and things like that. And so his license was challenged by the British Columbia College of Physicians. Uh, for people who are unaware, British Columbia is a very far left leading province in Canada. It's basically California in Canada. So, can you talk about what you wrote in defense of Dr. Hoff, the data that they were using against him? Because you made, see, when I was reading your your series that you wrote, it really struck me that the doctor that they had hired to create the case against Dr. Hoffe was sourcing his information from corrupted journals, and that was and studies, and that's basically what it was. And that's kind of how this whole system works, right? Is you get a journal or a study that's been corrupted, and then it allows these shills to reference them in their arguments or dissertations, and it's just basically one big cycle of lies. And you broke that down perfectly, incredibly. So can you talk about what happened to Dr. Hoffe, your defense of him, and what you discovered in the process?
Yeah. What's interesting is that, I wrote a book, which oh man, that was a labor of love that crushed me. And that book is, I don't know, a couple hundred pages. And, that's one of the main concepts that I try to communicate in that book. But when I looked at Dr. Hoff's, when their lawyer reached out to me to become the expert defense, and there's 4 accusations that they wanted me to defend him on. And I was looking at it, and I looked at what the expert wrote, and I could have been like, see chapter 7, 12, 15, and I could have just referenced chapters where I explored these topics, but that wasn't going to work very well. And I started to really think how I want to do this. And not that I'm looking for any more praise or anything, but I don't know. I suddenly I went at it, man. I took the gloves off, and I really worked hard on that defense. I just that expert and the way he wrote and the way he attacked Dr. Hoffe, and he's 100% wrong in every point he made. And he's literally going after the license of, a brother, really a brother in this fight. And I was like, not on my watch, man. And I put so many hours in that report, but you're right. So what I had to do is I had to introduce the concept of, let me be generous, although I don't want to be generous. Let's pretend that the expert, Dr. Trevor Cornell, let's pretend that he actually believes what he wrote and he wasn't a hired assassin. Because I think it's possible. I think it's possible that he actually literally, because he cited some of the top journals, in the world, all of the top agencies with all of the air quotes experts, right? So he is, in his mind, if I'm being generous, he is literally going to the world's top scientific literature, and he's making his statements and referencing that evidence. And so I felt like if anyone reading this, if I did the same and said, yeah, well, you said that study said it don't work. Well, I have a lot of studies here that says it works. That's just like a data fight.
Yeah.
And if that's a data fight, and my opinion is that ivermectin, it does work, then it's just our scientific opinions together, and they're always going to choose him because he's got the Cochrane Library, the New England Journal of Medicine, he's got the WHO, the NIH, all of the alphabet agencies. So Dr. Kory's data and how he amasses it clearly can't be as expert as all of these august institutions, right? So I decided that before I went into the ivermectin data, I had to paint what the world is really like. And so I wrote and I explained, I said, you have to understand, if you're going to discuss ivermectin, you have to understand that what happened to ivermectin is that it's the target of a massive disinformation campaign conducted by the pharmaceutical industry. So I went into the history of disinformation. I explained the tactics, and then I showed real life examples of how those long described tactics, right, which were invented by big tobacco in the 1950s, I described and showed how those disinformation tactics were exactly applied. And then it was actually almost kind of fun, by the way, because I think I made Cornell look like an absolute moron, because I was like, oh, you cited this study. I think we should take a look at this study. And then I just showed all of the brazen fraudulent manipulations that went into the Cochrane Library. The Cochrane Library, the #1 journal for meta-analyses in the world. Like, you get something to Cochrane is truth. I mean, Cochrane means that all the data has been amassed. If they say that aspirin works for heart attack, it works. If they say ivermectin doesn't work for COVID, it doesn't work for COVID. But Cochrane got captured about, this is my estimation, about 7 or 8 years ago. In fact, the one of the founders of the Cochrane Library, a guy named Peter Goche, he's written an amazing book about the pharmaceutical industry, but he started pushing back about what he saw happening in Cochrane. And you know what they did to him? They fired him off the board.
Oh, right.
So they got rid of like the last remaining ethical, courageous doctor, and that's also right around that time when Bill Gates' money started flooding into Cochrane. So I mean, I didn't even go into the criminal history of Cochrane. So it's a short history, but it's bad. I mean, the stuff that they've done in the last 5 or 6 years, but I didn't have to because I showed the overwhelming evidence. And by the way, what's really cool about the defense of Hoffe is like you think that I did it. I did do it, but I got a whole bunch of, I mean, I cited Tess Laurie's work, Edmund Fordham's work, because they really have gone after Cochrane Library. They've gone after the WHO. And so they've done really expert, dissections of all of the failures of some of those papers. So I think I was really, because I have experts to my right and left, I got to really show just how terrible the evidence that he cited. And also, he could have made a much stronger argument. He could have used 8 papers from the top journals of the world, and then I would have had 35 more hours to show that it's the same story over and over. In fact, he just referenced Cochrane, and then he referenced one really corrupt trial. I took those trials down, but you're right. It was presenting the context of how this could happen, because I didn't want it to be about my opinion. I wanted to show like this Dr. Cornel West does not know about this information, has not looked at these studies. He does not know the numerous faults in them, why those faults are there, yet it got published in some of the top journals in the world. Hopefully you took that point. Like once I go through and I demolish the Cochrane Library paper because there's so much crap in there, then a good astute reader will be left asking themselves, how could a paper like that get published in the Cochrane Library?
Right.
And same thing with the COVID out study, which he referenced, which is the one big RCT that he referenced. How could that paper get published in JAMA, in one of the top medical journals in the world, where literally these investigators were doing everything they could to disappear the evidence of efficacy? You could see it in all of their trial violations, protocol violations, hiding of data, misrepresenting of data, and let me give another shout out, because I also rely a lot, and we could talk about this for a quick minute, on the C19early.com group. You know who they are?
I don't, but please go into it.
You've never gone to that website?
No, I normally go to FLC. To be honest with you, so viewers of this podcast, regular viewers will know that my face swole up and became really red roughly around Christmas. And then around the same time, my varicocele flared up. And I was like, I'm 41, right? So I Google it. All of a sudden, I have lymphoma and I'm dying. So I was like, I've been going to FL. No. I wasn't diagnosed, just in my mind.
Yeah,
in my mind, right? And so I went to I've been going to FLCCC and stuff. And that's why the cancer stuff that you're talking about, I'm actually pretty aware of, because I was like, oh man, if I do have cancer, I'm going to need to know this. But no, please go into what you were saying.
Yeah, no. So C19early.com. I don't even know how to talk about them. So that's a website which, since COVID broke out, I think I discovered it maybe 6 months into the pandemic. But when someone sent me the link and I went there, I'd never seen anything like it. It is a real-time summary analysis of every therapeutic studied in COVID. So whether it's vitamin C, vitamin D, melatonin, colchicine, you go and they have every treatment listed. You click on the treatment and it shows you the entire list of all the trials done for that treatment. It shows you what the trial found. You can click on the trial, go to the actual paper, and so it's a real-time meta-analysis. So every single day, they were putting up new papers. And when you try to learn who they are, because they're anonymous. And I remember when I first discovered them, I was like, who's doing this? I've never seen science done at this sophisticated level. And they had a really tight protocol for how they did their meta-analyses. In case your listeners don't know, meta-analysis is when, let's say you're studying ivermectin. It's when you take all of the trials of ivermectin, and there's a very specific protocol and way in which you combine the data for the trials. So you have the largest sample size and you see what the summary benefit is. And so these guys were meta-analysis experts, and they came out with a very open, transparent protocol. Every medicine studied went through the same protocol, same inclusion, same exclusion criteria. And that includes the Paxlovids, the molnupiravir. I mean, they didn't just do repurposed drugs, but they did anything that potentially had benefit and was studied. And so when you go there, just it made like reviewing the literature, reviewing trials, like it made it child's play for me. So like I got to become an ivermectin expert like by relying on them. What was really funny is during the ivermectin craze, when I was really deep in studying ivermectin, um, there was not one trial that appeared on a preprint server or in publication that I knew about before that group did. Like, I don't know how big that group is or how many guys they had, but I think they were up at 3 in the morning and they were looking at every preprint server around the world because it was amazing. I mean, they had real time, like something would show up on a preprint at like 11 a.m. And by 5 p.m., you had their critique of the trial. They would put it right into the running summary meta-analysis. It was amazing. It was amazing. But anyway, so writing that report, like, I don't think I could have written a report that sophisticated, that well done without using C19 early as a resource. And I'll finish one last thing on them. So when you read it on their like about page, they just say that I can't remember what the wording is, but they just say like they've been doing science for a while. They've been on TV before. They're not really interested in fame and like they're just like a nonprofit who just they wanted to do good science. And for me, as bad as I talk about the destruction of science and the institutions and the capture, they stand out. That's real science. And to me, that was the best science being done in the pandemic, hands down, compared to any other organization in the world, any national, international healthcare agency. C19early.com was absolute gem. And I think they saved a lot of us making good, evidence-based scientific decisions in real time. It was excellent, excellent.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's what it's come down to in a lot of ways, right? Where it's just people working together from all fields. That I think that's kind of how we got through this. And, reading through your defense of Dr. Charles Hoffe, I understand that this is science, this is medicine. You have to speak a certain language, right? But the thing that has gotten me throughout the entire course of all this is all of the emphasis on randomized control trials, where it's like, they called the vaccine program Operation Warp Speed, right? Which meant we were moving at rapid pace. You would think that the harping on the need for randomized control trials the emphasis on it wouldn't be as prevalent as it was. And it's like, I remember you coming forward saying, hey, look, I've created this protocol, I'm saving lives. And the response from mainstream media was, well, where's the randomized control trials?
100%.
And it's like, well, did people die or did they live? They lived. There's your randomized control trial. There's your answer. Like, what are we doing here? Are we saving lives or are we in lab coats, in a lab somewhere trying to put together, data for some future problem that may occur? Like, you're on the ground, you're treating people with this protocol, people are living. You would think in a just world that people would say, okay, what is Pierre Kory doing? Let's get him on the phone immediately and get this protocol everywhere, all across the world, get everybody on top of this because he's actually saving lives. But that didn't happen. Instead, you were vilified. And, Amazon actually got their shit together and delivered your book to me. And I've been reading through it and it's amazing. Yeah, it's amazing what you've been through, man. Like, I get shit from some people sometimes for being too nice to my guests and saying too many nice things, but your courage through all this to stand up against this machine. And as time goes on, it's more evident that what we're dealing with is this massive death machine that's just chewing through everything. And you were one of the courageous few who stood up and said, no, fuck that. I'm going to save some lives here. I'm not going along with what you're doing. And now where you find yourself, I mean, you wrote this brilliant defense of Charles Hoffe, but the whole time I'm reading it, I'm thinking, why is this necessary?
Yeah.
Like I looked up Charles Hoffe because I actually wanted to talk to him, and it looks like he's retiring. Do you know, is his retirement in response to everything that he's been through, or is he just retiring, period?
Well, I think you know more. I mean, I've talked to Charles briefly. I think we did a we were on a similar podcast once, and then we've had a couple of emails, and he sent me a very appreciative email after he read my defense. But I hadn't been told he's retiring, so you probably know more than I do. But he, he and his lawyers, that they're fighting this, and you bring up like, why is this happening? And that's now we're outside of medicine. I mean, he didn't hurt anyone, right? I mean, they're going after him for misinformation because they think what he said is wrong, and they're going after him, with this, 200-page, attack on him by some expert, which is full of nonsense, and they're trying to take his license, and he's up against penalties of 100,000. I mean, that's something else. I mean, I know what that is. I mean, it's the same reason why they went after me, Merrick, and McCullough, the American Board of Internal Medicines, because they want to send a message.
Yeah.
Those in power, one of the disinformation tactics of the five that industries employ when science emerges that's inconvenient to their interest. One of them is called the Blitz. And the definition of the Blitz is harassing scientists who are producing that inconvenient views or science. And, there's articles like Merck used to have hit lists against anti-Vioxx doctors. So like, remember in Vioxx, when the criminal fines, they paid for that. So even though they were selling a drug that was killing people, they kept lists of the doctors who were like out in public with some stature, some notoriety, some stature, who were like saying, hey, I'm not liking this Vioxx drug. I don't like the data for this or that. They would go after those doctors. So they go after, I mean, and now their power is so consolidated. I mean, they pick up the phone, they can call the College of Physicians, Surgeons, and be like, get rid of this guy Hoffe, shut him up, and I'll give you another example. So Umberto Duri, who's one of the five who founded the FLCCC. He's one of the world experts in the use of corticosteroids in critical illness and in lung injury. And during the height of the ivermectin vaccine craze, his boss came to him and said, you need to resign, otherwise you're not going to have a pension. And he was like, what? What's going on? And they're like, you got to resign. And his boss was actually his former trainee, who now became his boss. He was doing more research, and Umberto asked him, and the guy told him that the call came in from Washington, because he works he works in a federal government administration, in a Veterans Administration. So that's
Right.
Federal government. He's a federal government employee.
Right.
And so Washington called Memphis, where he's working, and basically told them, get rid of him.
That is.
So his career ended. And by the way, not only his career ended, but he had a huge biobank of all research samples for all the studies he was doing in advanced lung disease. And he had grants coming. And so his whole entire career ended with a phone call from Washington, because he was and he was the least vocal. Umberto kept his head down. I mean, he was an advisor to us on the science, but he wasn't like out on podcasts, like me, big loudmouth and all that stuff. And but they whacked him.
And these aren't accountants, right? Like, these are people who know how to save lives, right? Again, not to blow smoke, but doctors are some of the most valuable people in any society. If you want to start a town, you don't start one without a doctor, right?
Yeah.
And so, okay, just before you go, because I know you have a patient you have to get to, but I want to talk about vaccine shedding here really quickly, because I heard about vaccine shedding early on in the COVID-19 in the mRNA rollouts, and to me it was like just like one of the kookiest things I'd ever heard, because in all fairness, I'm kind of an idiot. But what have you learned about vaccine shedding? What are the impacts that the shedding is having, and how prevalent is it?
Okay, I'm going to start with the last one, because that's the one we don't know. We think it's generally rare. It's not so rare in my practice. It's not so rare in my practice because, and I don't know why that is. I think there's something about being vaccine injured. They've now become a little bit more sensitive to the spike. But in the general population, it's generally rare. But there are exceptions. Like, for instance, we know it happens much more after booster campaigns. It's my general experience that women are much more affected than men, because the most common symptom of shedding is a menstrual irregularity, and women are quite sensitive to that. And We're aware of a study. It's an actual study being done. The problem is the authors will not share it with me and Paul because it's nearing publication. It's like pretty high up in the peer review process, and for whatever reason, they didn't want to. We told them that we would embargo the results, but so I don't know the exact extent of the study, but I just know the top line is that they took, I think, 100 women vaccinated, exposed them to 100 unvaccinated women, and there was a very high rate of menstrual irregularities that followed. And which you've already seen from social media. Many women noticed that things were going really weird when the vaccine campaign rolled out, even though they weren't vaccinated. There's some, the first two vaccinated people I ever treated was in February and March of 21. It was actually a podcaster who reached out to me and she said, my friend just went to her massage therapist appointment the other day. They'd just been boosted or, vaccinated. And she's like really sick. So I talked to her. She was cramping. Oh, that was the thing. She had missed her period and she hadn't missed a period in like 17 or 18 years. She said she was like a clock. She said, I've never had a problem. She's I had this visit with this massage therapist. Next day, she's like cramping. I missed my period, and like her breasts were tender and swollen. And it was interesting. And I knew a lot about ivermectin. I said, well, if that's real, I didn't even know if it was real at the time. I was like, ivermectin is one of the strongest binding compounds to spike protein. And I remember I gave her like 5 days of ivermectin and her symptoms resolved and I did that again a month later. But then I kind of forgot about shedding for a long time because no one was really reporting it to me. But then when we started practice, me and Scott, we started seeing it in our practice. We started having patients tell us. And then what I did in the last week and a half. So you read my shedding series, but I actually turned that into a much more formal academic document. It's a single document, and I partnered with, I don't know, do you know the writer who's called A Midwestern Doctor?
Yes, I do. I
Yeah,
follow
'cause
you on X, so I read a
yeah,
lot of
so
that stuff.
I tweet their stuff a lot, but I'm just gonna say they and I because they don't want me to tell their gender. It's not that they don't know their gender. They just
A little
they just
confused
don't
about
want it revealed
right.
whether they're a he or a she. So I'm
Right.
using they not in the woke term, okay? Just it's gonna be an anonymous term.
They them. We'll just say they them pronouns. There we go.
No, but they did their own series, and then they did this Herculean task where, with my Twitter, we did a public call out for testimonials and case reports and anecdotes of shedding, and we were over 1,000 entries. And then they like really reviewed that, and we kind of like ordered into the most common symptoms and the most common exposures. And so we're like learning a lot more about the dynamics of shedding. But I'll tell you, listeners, if they have not gotten any weird symptoms after being around others, they're not sensitive to shedding. Because the main thing about shedding is only certain people are sensitive. And we think that they have a particular constitution of a history of long time environmental and physiologic sensitivities like to medicines or weather or allergens and pollens or even EMF. There are EMF sensitive people. You could drive a truck over me and I'd still get up. You could blare a radio, an antenna tower next to my head, I would go to sleep. Like I have like zero sensitivity. But
Right.
I've had patients, I've taken care of patients, I've known quite a few people in my life who are like ridiculously sensitive to lots of stuff that are in our environment. And that's what we think of the shedders.
So with the shedding, what they're actually shedding are spike proteins. And is it coming
100%.
through the skin? Through the skin?
So the way that we think there's a number of routes, but really the most is through exhale breath. So without going into too much of the science, the FDA knows that shedding occurs with gene therapies. They've always said that you have to do shedding studies. They weren't done with these vaccines. All the other gene therapy products on the market all have in their insert that there's a risk of shedding. So like, I'm not making this up. Like there's real science here for shedding. But what happens is what these, besides being gene therapies, the vaccines, I think, are better thought of as nanoparticle technology because the mRNA is in these little synthetic lipid nanoparticles. We have a biologic counterpart, which we call exosomes. They're all over our body. They're used for cell-to-cell communication. Exosomes are in the breath, they're in the feces, they're in all our fluids, and they also circulate in our bodies and tissues. But what happens is when the spike protein is made, they have an affinity for exosomes. And so then they get packaged into our biologic exosomes, and then they're exhaled in the breath. They can go out in the sweat. And so, and if you look at a lot of the clinical reports, most of it is just being in close proximity, but there's a number of reports after touching them. And you know, I've had patients, I remember a couple of reports where like they sat next to like their cousin and their legs were touching, you know, because they were on a bench somewhere, and like the next day they were like bruised everywhere all along, right where they were touching their cousin. But there was no trauma, there's nothing like that. So we know that some of it can be skin to skin, but the vast majority is just exhale breath.
Wow. Okay. So I know you got to run. I want to ask you one final question to conclude.
Sure.
It's maybe too big a question to answer quickly, but I want to ask it. Denis Rancourt put together a study,
Yeah.
an estimated 17 million deaths worldwide attributed to the mRNA vaccines. I asked Dr. Robert Malone what he thought. He said he thought Rancourt hit it out of the park with his study. Have you had a chance to get a look at it at all? And if so, what are your thoughts?
I have, and I think that conclusion of Rancourt's is totally supported by his data. The where, and I haven't talked to Dennis, we haven't had interaction, but he is part of a group who believe. So this is apart from his estimated, you know, vaccine-induced fatalities. That I cannot argue with him. I think that's in line with all the data we've seen from New Zealand. Steve Kirsch has been doing this for a long time. He already had a paper, you know, a year and a half ago that was predicting 500,000 just in this country alone. So I mean, it's totally fits. Um, the where I get confused is there's a faction of colleagues who feel that SARS-CoV-2 was not novel and not deadly, or not particularly deadly, and that all of the excess mortality before the vaccines, after the vaccines, it's clear the vaccines, but before was all due to scaremongering and lockdowning and things like that. And that is, I don't want to say a bad word or a demeaning word, but no way will I ever get there.
Mhm.
Just that is black and white for me. I've heard their arguments. All of their arguments, by the way, are hypotheses. None of them provide data. What they do is they try to provide data telling me that my beliefs are wrong, or meaning my beliefs aren't specific enough. They say, well, yes, but you haven't proven it wasn't this, it wasn't that, it wasn't this. I was like, I didn't say what it wasn't. I just saying there was a novel pathogen, right? You know, the novel pathogen argument.
Yeah.
And actually, myself, and I would say nearly every single one of my frontline clinician colleagues, we're done. We're moving on with our lives.
Yeah.
And you know what I told them, I'm trying not to be mean. I'm like, when you guys figure it out and come up with the answer to your hypothesis, let me know. I said, you haven't found it yet. Because what they're telling me is that I don't know the difference between flu and COVID, which is just bonkers. And then they even suggest that maybe there was a vaping epidemic. Yeah. Yeah. I'm just saying. So like I gotta be real. I gotta be efficient with my time. I gotta go back to planet Earth. And so when they land back with a good answer, give it to me and I'm willing to learn. But they haven't given me anything that I'm interested in as an explanation, other than my best explanation. This is where I go a little bonkers is, have you read Wuhan Cover Up?
No, I haven't. No.
I would suggest you do. And it's one of the most terrifying books you'll ever read, because it literally goes over the history of bioweapons research. And you will find out that for about 70 years, the US military has been releasing biologic agents, toxins in the US population in numerous communities over the last 6 or 7. Just depraved, really crazy things that have gone on in the bioweapons field. And so what I suggest to those no new novel pathogens, they're always saying like what happened in New York was anomaly. Over here, nobody died. And they're trying to explain like this wasn't pathogen. I was like, I don't know. I think they just released a lot in New York and New Orleans and Seattle and in Bologna. And like, I don't know why your models aren't answering, but don't tell me this wasn't a new disease. I'm an expert at respiratory failure. I'm an expert at like acute illnesses. It's like, I've never seen anything like this before. So don't tell me this. You know, it's to be honest, it was quite insulting. And I was
Yeah.
actually almost at my limit. Like I was really trying to engage because I think they appreciated that someone was willing to listen to them kind of scientifically and trade data and viewpoints. But there was a few times where, I mean, these guys are like armchair jockeys, like doing data, like, you know, come walk around an ICU for 20 years, working overnights, 36-hour shifts,
Right.
taking care of people in all forms of respiratory and distress. And you're going to tell me that I mistook COVID for something I've been seeing for 20, like,
Yeah.
I'm done. I'm done. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah. So in your view, what we experienced, did it classify as a pandemic?
Yeah, so that's the other one. So I don't know really the differences, but it was a scaredemic for sure. I think everyone got scared. It's very hard for me to answer that question, to be honest, because I was in New York
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
New York was a real disaster zone. So for me, I understand in retrospect that what I was living through in New York City at that time was not like, but I mean, I came and relieved people I trained that I'd worked with for years. I came and relieved them after they'd been through that surge for 6 weeks. And I mean, they were literally at war. They had battled a war zone. They had
Hmm.
seen so much death and dying and so much illness and so much running out of resources. And I mean, they literally had worked in a war zone for 6 weeks, and so I get it. It wasn't like that everywhere, but for me in New York City, that was a war zone, and that was a true medical emergency.
Yeah, I think how it ended up here is a mystery, but hopefully as they continue to tighten the vices on Anthony Fauci and maybe
Yep,
someday Peter Daszak will get closer to the truth.
we'll
It
see.
puzzles me how those fucking scumbags are still just walking around doing their thing. Anyways, Dr. Pierre
Yeah.
Kory. Sorry, did you have something to add to that?
No, no, I think what you said is perfect, and it's always a pleasure talking with you. And keep rock with your podcast, man. It's always fun to talk to you.
Yeah, once again, everybody, War on Ivermectin, go get that book. Dr. Pierre Kory, before you run, can you tell us where everybody can find you?
Oh yeah. So FLCCC.net is my nonprofit. My private practice where I treat vaccine injury and now cancer with complementary cancer care is drpierrekory.com, drpierrekory.com. And then my Substack is pierrekorymedicalmusings.com.
Pierre Kory, once again, man, always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Okay, take care now. Bye.